there's been a lot happening in the economic front in the past few weeks. There are many investors in South Africa who are absolutely furious at the Treasury coming out with its intention to regulate their holdings of crypto and other assets. And also, we are seeing the impact of the Iran war on forecasts that were made just 3 months ago on the economy, and they have now been, well, they're in tatters. And of course, the impact on that for the economy as a whole is huge. Dawie Roodt is the favorite economist of the Biz News tribe, and he's joined us this morning. Dawie, let's start with that the hot topic of the moment, the ownership of crypto, and the way that the Treasury's gone about this has ruffled a lot of feathers.
Hello, Alec. Always very nice talking to you. Maybe we can just talk a little bit about cryptos. When you talk about crypto, people usually think you are talking about Bitcoin and Bitcoin only. There's much more to cryptos than only Bitcoin. The important thing here has to do with the underlying technology. And this underlying technology, of course, is a blockchain technology. And in fact, it's not that people think also that if you use cryptos, that you're some sort of criminal somewhere and you're trying to launder money or you're selling drugs or whatever the case may be. That certainly is not the case. There are many kinds of cryptos. And in fact, the authorities are starting to use this specific cryptos or the underlying technology. And examples of that are things like, for example, central bank digital currencies. But there's a new thing. There's a new thing that are being used more and more, and that's so-called stablecoins, and that's also on the blockchain technology. And stablecoins are typically a coin that is issued backed by something. And the most popular stablecoin is a US dollar stablecoin backed by either US dollars or Treasury bills or whatever the case might be. And this is being used especially in wholesale transactions. What's currently happening in the Gulf, for example, many of these big tankers, the oil, are sold, making use of so-called stable coins. There's a lot of wholesale transactions happening in Europe, for instance, making use of US dollar stable coins. And in fact, the European Central Bank is getting a little bit concerned about that. But the good thing for Africa is that US dollar stable coins or other stable coins can be used as retail money as well in Africa. And that can potentially force out some of these smaller currencies in Africa as well. But the point I want to make here is that crypto is information. It is, and it's like a WhatsApp message, or it's a message that you send on the internet, and that information contains certain, well, potentially value. In the case of crypto coins, for example, Bitcoin or stable coins or whatever the case might be. But you cannot, it's not limited to a geographic area. Information is not limited to South Africa or anywhere. And this is where maybe another piece of information, and that is that we have foreign exchange regulations in South Africa, which means that I get, as an adult man, I get an allowance from Minister of Finance allowing me to take some money out of the country. And this is the big difference between normal money like rands and crypto money, is that normal money can be stopped from leaving the country. And I say in inverted commas because it never leaves the country. Leaving the country because it needs to go through certain channels like the banking system. While in the case of crypto, I can move it wherever I want to as long as I've got an internet connection and nobody can stop me. And that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to stop. And that's impossible. That's impossible to stop.
You don't need an allowance from the Minister of Finance as an adult person to be able to take certain amounts. I like the way you put that. But just getting back to stable coins, if I understand correctly, in Zimbabwe, if you want to trade, you get these dirty old dollar bills, US dollar bills. Stable coins, would they replace those dollar bills that people physically have to hold?
Just maybe another piece of background that's important as well. We can't send US dollar stablecoins probably to Sudan because they've never heard of it. They do not have the necessary infrastructure. It won't work there. So you need some basic infrastructure in order to people. I mean, you need to educate people. You need to get somebody to sort of facilitate the trade. You need a platform typically, not necessarily, but typically you need a platform. Let me give you an example of a platform in South Africa. There are a number of exchanges in South Africa. Luno is a very good example of an exchange in South Africa. So I can buy Bitcoin on Luno and I can convert that into stable coins, dollar stable coins, and I can send it to my kids in Netherlands, for example, and they can convert that back into euro. And there's no way that the Minister of Finance can stop that. Now, this is what the new legislation proposes. They say, and there are many things that they say, and it just goes to show that people that proposed it made these proposals simply do not understand what they are talking about. That is as simple as that. They're completely clueless on the nature of this technology. Now, let me give you an example. I've got right up there, I can show you if you want to. I've got something called a cold wallet. Now, cold wallet looks like a little. You want me to show you the cold wallet?
Yeah,
Let
yeah,
me
please.
show you
Yeah.
the cold wallet. Now, here they are. You can buy them on Take a Lot. These cold wallets. This is the most recent one, a cold wallet. Basically, what it looks like, and there are different ones, and it looks like a little memory stick like this. Okay, sorry. It looks like a little memory stick like this. Let me show you. It looks like this, for example. And you plug it in into your computer and you use a specific program, and there's a password on the thing that you have to fill in, and you can put your cryptos on this little cold wallet. And the benefit of this cold wallet is since it's not connected to the internet, it's impossible for anybody to hack that. Yeah, and if I need some Bitcoin, I can take it off my cold wallet and I can put it in a wallet on the internet and I can use it for transactions, for example. But here's the wonderful thing about this thing is that if I lose this cold wallet, I can actually get this information back by memorizing 20 passwords. Okay, I can memorize it. So I can memorize my 20 passwords and I can chuck this into the fire and I get on a plane, I go to wherever I want to, and I can get my money back by just going into a certain program and put my 20 words or passwords down there. Voila, the money is back again. So now, this is why I say it's such a stupid idea, these proposals by Treasury, because how are they going to get into my head? Now they want to force me to give them my passwords and they want to force me to open up my phone or my computer and they want to force me to sell my so-called cryptocurrencies at the price that they determine to them typically, for example. But it don't these people understand that the world has moved forward and there are new technologies and they cannot stop me anymore. This is not normal rands that we're talking about that's forced to go work through the banking system. This is new technology, and you do not have power over me anymore. And that means that we have to get rid of foreign exchange regulations altogether because if we don't, I will stop using the rand and keep on using some other currencies because there I've got more control over. So I think it's very interesting to see the way that they approach this, but it's very clear to me they don't understand what we're doing. But more importantly, we can actually see what the whole intention behind all of this is. We can understand the ideology behind Treasury. And the ideology is they want to control everything. But the nature of the technology is they can't control me anymore. And that's the wonderful thing. That also means there's more responsibility to me. I mean, I need to take responsibility for my decisions. And it is possible for me to buy drugs and to send money to terrorist organizations and things like that. So that certainly is a possibility. But the benefits are absolutely amazing. Imagine people that do not have access to a banking system somewhere in rural Africa and they start using these stable coins. Now, all of a sudden, they've got very low transaction fees and they can send their money all over the world 24/7. And it's being used by big organizations for big wholesale financial transactions already.
But that's quite scary for the banking system, for banks themselves.
Two things are important here. Remember what happens now, in simple terms, how it works. So you take your money and you give it to a stablecoin issuer, and typically you take your money away from a deposit in a bank. So the banks are running out of deposits, and the banks don't like this because now they need to go and borrow money on the financial markets, which is more expensive. So potentially the margins of banks are going to get under some pressure, and that's a big fight at the moment in the United States. And they're trying between whether the crypto issuers are allowed to pay interest or not. So that's one set of companies that will potentially be affected by these new stable coins, and that's the banks. Another one is the credit card companies, because these crypto sending stable coins from me to somebody in Malawi or wherever in Africa, for example, the transaction cost is significantly lower. So doing transactions in these stable coins is much, much cheaper than using a credit card, as an example. So the credit card companies don't like this either. And that is the reason why many of the credit card companies are actually moving into these stable coins as well. Another example of a company that's using this is M-Peso. We know about M-Peso in East Africa. Well, that's a very successful payment system. And they also realized the importance of these stablecoins. And they recently went into some uh, agreements with certain crypto stablecoin issuers, and they starting to use crypto stablecoin money as well. So what is happening? Our government is holding South Africa back. Here's an opportunity to actually modernize our payment system and make it easier for everybody.
Well, you've opened our eyes a lot there, Dawie, but I guess from the government's point of view, they've had all this issue with grey listing. Isn't that maybe what's motivating their thoughts?
That's a very good point you're making there, Alec. The reality is that if we start using these kind of crypto, these stable coins, for example, it is possible, like I've said, much easier for me to send money to terrorist organizations or launder money. But crucially important, it will be easier for me to evade taxes as well. And that's what politicians are concerned about. Don't believe this nonsense about terrorism and all that. Of course, they're concerned about that, but they're primarily concerned about losing tax revenue. That is. So, yes, that certainly is a concern. But, and this is a very important but, say the compliance cost for complying with all this legislation, complying, and ask me, because we've got a department that have to fill in forms every day. So the compliance cost to all this legislation that's supposed to cover money laundering and all this terrorist financing and all that, it is a massive cost to the economy. Now, go and have a look how many actual money was confiscated from terrorist organizations, of people giving money to terrorist organizations, of criminal syndicates, whatever, trying to launder drug money, for example. It is a tiny, tiny fraction of the total cost of this compliance to an economy. So the reality, there's always a trade-off between benefits, cost, and benefits. And let me make the statement, is that horrible compliance cost to the economy far exceeds the potential benefit of catching a couple of criminals trying to launder money, for example. And so I think it will be to the benefit of economies if we reduce this massive compliance costs. And it is the job of the police, for example, in any way, to go and catch the criminals. And the majority of criminal transactions that happens with cash in any event. And that's the police's job. So why put this a massive compliance cost on all this regulation, which will include this new regulations or suggestion from Treasury on the economy and actually smothering the economy? Get the police to do their job. Their job is to make sure that criminals do not do what they are doing.
Healthcare matters, but what matters most?
Having cover for the people who keep this business going.
Bonitas is there for you when it counts. Bonitas, medical aid for South Africa. Visit bonitas.co.za and find your plan.
You know, if we take this to the logical conclusion, and it might not happen tomorrow and it might not happen in a year, but it'll happen eventually. If you push the envelope too much onto people, if you make people too hurtful, eventually, even people who want to play with you, who want to support you, are going to turn around and say, why should I be paying taxes when it's all getting wasted? Let alone the corruption side. And what you said a little bit earlier about it enables you to evade taxes. What do the politicians do when they're faced with that issue, excepting for what they're doing now?
That is exactly the point. The tax burden in South Africa is excessive. But there's a massive tax burden on a very, very narrow tax base. That is, we don't even need to debate that. That is a fact. And the reality also is that our tax money is a large chunk of our tax money is simply misspent and stolen. A lot of that. That is the fix those problems. I do not have a problem with paying taxes, but I've got a massive problem with some people pay just about all the taxes, and a lot of the money that's being spent are badly spent. Clean up your own house before you start putting more pressure on the taxpayer in the country.
We know the reality is that many people do not pay VAT, for instance. They just don't. And there's many ways that the system is gamed through supposedly purchasing for export, but you're never exporting it in the first place, so you don't pay the VAT, and those goods go into the system. There's lots of this stuff happening. But if I'm in a politician's shoes, it's easy at the moment. You go to this largely compliant tax base who may be small, but they pay their taxes. They don't want to end up in jail. When you look at what you've explained now with crypto and with stable coins, etc., does it not scare them rigid that that tiny tax base is going to evade and say, here's a way of doing it. You've pushed me so far. Here's a way of actually not paying taxes anymore using stable coins. And how would a politician, if you were a politician, how would you react to that?
Well. What we are seeing, if you have a massive tax burden on a relatively few number of people paying, it's a modern kind of slavery. People don't like this because you are forced to work for the state. Basically, that's what it comes down to. And many people are trying to escape this slavery by just not working or aggressively structuring the tax affairs or literally by emigrating. So that what I would have done if I was a politician, I would realize that there's a limit to how much you can take from people. People are not stupid. They know, and people are prepared to contribute to the state. People are prepared to redistribute their wealth. They do that. There's no problem with that. But it is your responsibility as a politician to understand that you must make life easier for the taxpayer and you must use the taxpayer money well. And if you don't do that, there is an alternative to for the taxpayer, like what I've just explained. So understand that and realize that. And instead of fighting the taxpayer, and instead of fighting the free economy, work with the free economy to the benefit of everybody, including the taxman. SARS is just as dependent on a growing economy as the rest of us. Realize that and work with the economy and do not try to fight the flow of money or fight entrepreneurship. And this new kind of technology is exactly that. It's a kind of technology that's reducing transaction costs, and now you want to regulate it again with all sort of red tape and an army of compliance officers trying to comply with all these silly rules that you have. And looking at the proposals, it's clear that the people making these proposals simply do not understand the technology.
How are they going to understand that? How is the penny going to drop there? Do we have to have a situation where people who previously were happy to pay their taxes, in fact, say, no, I'm not going to do this anymore?
Well, there's examples of what's going to happen if they keep on trying to do these sort of things, and that the private sector is simply going to ignore them. And there are many examples in South Africa. Look, for example, what's been happening to electricity. So you mismanage Eskom, you destroyed Eskom, and the private sector is simply ignoring you, putting our own solar systems on the roof. There are many other examples where people are. Look at the local authorities. Many local authorities simply collapsed, and the private sector is taking it over. They've got these security. And the horrible thing of all of this is everybody can't do that. There are so many poor people that can't look after themselves. But people are building societies that are not dependent on the state anymore. The state is becoming irrelevant, especially in South Africa, where the ANC is trying to centralize everything. And in the process of centralizing everything, everything is actually falling apart and is being decentralized. See what is happening to Transnet now. They basically ran Transnet into the ground, and Transnet is forced now to essentially privatize a large chunk of the operation of Transnet. So, so that's what's going to happen. You keep on trying to regulate things, and we're simply going to ignore you and do our own thing. That's what's going to happen.
So the state will get smaller and smaller because people are not going to run away. Everybody's not going to emigrate. They're going to mark a plan.
Mark Blunt, just ignore the state and go on. Create what Pete Lucreau calls a state-proof businesses. And that's what people are doing, creating state-proof businesses.
When you have a look at the economy generally, and I want to bring this back to where we are at the moment and the geopolitical impact that we've had on our energy prices or fuel prices. In February, the finance minister was talking about a 1.6% GDP growth rate for South Africa, which is pretty poor, but it's better than where we've been for a long time. Is that even a possibility now that we've got these heightened fuel prices?
Let's give credit when it's due, Alec. And last year, and you and I, we spoke about this. There were a couple of green shoots. We could see that things started to look a little bit less bad. GDP growth 1.6, like you've mentioned, is not good, but it is a little bit better. I think it was a little bit on the high side, but anyway, not impossible. Debt level stabilizing, fiscal stuff like things were looking a little bit upbeat. And very importantly, we reduced inflation targets to 3%. And we're not talking enough about that. I'll come back to that just now. So that it looks, things seemed as if we were reaching a turning point and a little bit better. And then we've got this now the war in the Middle East, and all of that is off the table. We just saw the most recent inflation data at 4%. That's very, very high. It's probably going to accelerate a little bit further. And the Reserve Bank probably going to increase interest rates as well. And the sooner the better, just by the way. And we can chat about that as well. So, but anyway, so where are we now? I think economic growth is probably going to be down to 1% or less than that. If the oil price goes to 120, we're talking about much lower. We even talk about the possibility for recession in South Africa. Personally, I think the Strait of Hormuz will be open soon. I see the oil price is coming down nicely. Whenever a ship passes through there, the oil price comes down. So, and also keep in mind that we're lying a high base for inflation. So technically, in a year's time, inflation is likely to come down, even if the oil price remains where it is. So imagine a situation where peace breaks out in the Middle East. In the meantime, the economy is going to suffer in the short term, there's no doubt. But imagine there's some sort of peace in the Middle East, oil starts flowing, oil price currently at $100 odd, and now oil starts flowing and the oil price gradually comes down, and some other oil producers start producing more, like for example, the Emirates. They've got about 2.5 million barrels per day surplus capacity that they can pump into the markets as well. Gradually, Venezuela will come online as well. And I can quite easily foresee an oil price in the region of well below $70 within a year's time if the Strait of Hormuz is open soon, now, within a month or two, say, for instance. And then the opposite is going to happen. We're going to see inflation really falling sharply, and we're going to see the opportunity for central banks all over the world, especially in South Africa, to start cutting interest rates as well. But in the short term, I think it's crucially important for the Reserve Bank. Initially, when I did the numbers, I thought, yeah, this is not looking good. We're probably facing 3 times 25 bips increase in interest rates in order to make sure inflation remains relatively low. Then I listened to the Reserve Bank, and I was thinking about this a little bit. And I obviously, like I've just explained, you will see this bump in inflation. So does it make sense to really kill the economy by 3 times 25 bips when inflation is going to go up and probably going to start coming down again? And it's okay, 25 is perhaps too much, or 3 times. So I thought to myself, maybe 2 times 25. And then I think what I think now is the best approach for the Reserve Bank is inflation expectations is crucially important. So what I would do if I was the governor, I would say, listen, you guys, we have to manage this thing. We're going to see inflation going above our upper end of the, well, it's essentially we still have a band in a way of 4%. We're probably going to see inflation going to 5. We have to address inflation expectations now. We cannot go for a huge increase in interest rates. That's going to completely kill the economy. So what I'm going to do, just to make sure that inflation expectations are anchored, I'm going to go for an increase now of 25 bips and then sit on my hands and wait. That's what I would have done if I was the governor of the Reserve Bank. But still, other factors like, for example, oil price and diesel and all of that will still affect the economy, and high interest rates will affect the economy. And I can't say we're going to get to 1% this year. So basically, but all the good things that might have happened this year has been postponed for about a year. But the good news is, in a year's time, if everything falls into place, there certainly will be room to start cutting interest rates much more than what would have been the case, say, 3 months or so ago.
So it's short-term pain, long-term gain.
Yeah, that's what I see at the moment. There is, and maybe just this comment. That rand is trading at 16.5, close to 17, somewhere in that range, kind of, to the US. That is actually a very, very good level. So the rand actually behaved very nicely during this crisis. And that's a sign of the markets having confidence in the Reserve Bank that the Reserve Bank will do whatever is necessary, even if it is painful to the economy. So actually, we are seeing the benefits of many years of the Reserve Bank building up its credibility. We're seeing the benefits in a way of an exchange rate that's actually relatively stable. Imagine the rand went to 18. Just imagine what would have happened to inflation and all those sort of things in the economy. Now, the Reserve Bank did a pretty good job. Well done to them.
But Dawie, getting back to the part that we spoke about in the first half of this interview on crypto, was that not a direct consequence of the action of the Reserve Bank? That court case between Standard Bank and the Reserve Bank seemed to trigger all of this.
I also, and I have a lot of respect for the Reserve Bank and the way they conduct monetary policy. There were a couple of slips at the Reserve Bank. One is then the whitewash of Pala Pala, Cyril Ramaphosa. That was the one, the first big slip. And the other one is that I think the Reserve Bank is also not really on top of the most recent technologies as well. And but in a way, one can understand that central banks are very conservative. Central banks are supposed to be very conservative. Their responsibility is to make sure not only inflation, their responsibility is also to make sure that the financial system essentially remains stable in the country. So a very conservative approach, in a way, I can understand it from the Reserve Bank. But I would have liked to see the Reserve Bank getting uh, a little more into this new technology. For example, why not start thinking about the central bank digital rand? Many countries are doing that. It seemed to me there was a time 3 or 4 years ago when the Reserve Bank had this special division doing active research in this new technology. That seemed to me as if that faded away.
Mm. So the opportunity is there. The Reserve Bank needs to wakaskrik in a way on a lot of what's going on, but they do have the mandate to keep things conservative, because if they make a mistake, then there are huge implications. But your reading of the whole thing, when we bring it all together, we're going to have a tough year because the oil price is affecting so many parts of our economy. But longer term, or even medium term, that's not the real issue. The real issue seems to be what's going on now with the way that crypto is transforming the whole payment system.
Yeah. Well, that is one thing. But of course, in the case of South Africa, we've got many, many other obstacles. We've made some policy changes, like lower inflation, for example, targets. That's a policy change. But there are many other things that we need to change as well. Like, for example, we have to look at various other policies that are just unsustainable. The real economy, even without the crisis in the Middle East, the real economy would not have grown, even at 1.6%. I mean, that's just not good enough. How can we? I mean, so we need to, and that's a political question. The local authorities are a mess. We know that. The state, the SOEs, and so on. There are some signs. I mentioned Transnet, for example, and even Eskom, of a better management and a turning around of some of those institutions. But look at Johannesburg. I mean, Johannesburg is falling apart. I mean, they're swimming in the potholes, quite literally, in Johannesburg. You can't run an economy where your biggest uh, city, Johannesburg, owes more than 5 billion rand to Eskom because of its management. I mean, you can't do that. You've got to fix those sort of things before the economy will really start growing.
What would give you hope? Come the local election now on the 4th of November, would it give you hope, for instance, that South African voters say no more of this? Would that be something we should be looking for?
Yeah, that is in the end what really matters, and that's politics. And we'll have an opportunity at the end of this year. And what I've seen so far is the ANC losing big time. Of course, as always, South African politics is very complicated and difficult to understand, and people don't understand why people vote in certain patterns typically. But I think that is the historic reasons why people vote for certain political parties. That is becoming less important. So we're starting to vote for bread and butter stuff. So let's see what's going to happen in Johannesburg. That's a big one. But I have a suspicion is that the ANC has run out of options and ideas. And in fact, they ran out of good leaders some time ago already. Look at the possible with Paul Masachile, Fikile Mbalula, even Gwede Mantashe. My goodness gracious. I mean, these guys can't even pack a dishwasher. And I mean, there's no way they can become president or should become president. And there's a certain possibility of that. And we know that. People know this, and they're getting rid of the ANC. So yes, the political tide is turning, and I think for the better for South Africa. We did it before, and we're going to do it again.
Dawie Roodt is the founder and chief economist of the Efficient Group. I'm Alec Hogg from biznews.com.